All right, let's see if I can do this. Okay, that's 1, 2, 3, 4. All right, I think we're all spotlighted now. So what Zoom is telling me that we can do with this is what anybody will see, and I'm going to stop the recording so I'm not. All right, so we're going. Here we go now. So welcome everybody. This is a Thirsty for Knowledge Thursday. It's a weekly webinar series that's brought to you by the Aries Foundation for Financial Education, Inc. As we get started here, I just want to make sure that everybody is on the right flight this evening, that you've checked in for the right takeoff here. This is creating an accessible workplace for people with visual impairments. We've got some special guests with us tonight. I'm going to introduce them in a couple of minutes. We're very excited about that. But really quick little pre-flight checklist for everybody. Your microphones are muted. The cameras, more than likely, they're off. You can keep it that way. We've got the spotlight for just the 4 of us who will be presenting this evening. But if you do have any questions, please feel free to use the chat box to ring those out. There will be time for Q&A at the end. But if something comes up and you've got a question, feel free to type it into the chat box. I just want to make sure that that's working. So if you get a chance, if you can, just do it for me right now and just give me either a yes or a thumbs up or something in the chat box right now real quick, which leads me to my co-pilot in all of this, Craig, who will be manning the chat box and making sure that everything is okay. Terrific. That's great. I appreciate that. Glad that that's working. So like I said, use the chat box if you do have any question. As I said, your pilots for tonight's flight. My name is Tom Alessi. I am the president of the Aries Foundation for Financial Education. I have been in financial services for more than 21 years now. I'm an investment advisor, which means I've got to act as a fiduciary and have that capacity whenever I'm dealing with any of my clients or any of their investments. To set the scene for all of you, I was sort of giving Mike and Bruce, our guests, a little bit on it. You'll for those who can see me, I am wearing a Bruins jersey. For most of you, if you see us out and about sometimes, we're usually in Patriots jerseys, but we know how that's been going for the Pats this season. So I thought I'd throw a little bit of luck on and throw the Bruins jersey on for the presentation tonight. Craig, you want to bring yourself on? My co-pilot this evening is Craig. Craig, you want to tell a little bit about yourself?
Sure. So I'm Craig Richardson. I'm the vice president of the Aries Foundation. I've been in the financial services world a little over 16 years now. I specialize in working with families and small businesses to help them develop a financial plan so they have a better future and a better relationship with their money. And that's what I do. Back to you. Are you with us, Tom?
Now I am. See, now it's perfect. Sorry, I had a technical glitch there. Something happened there, and I wigged out with it. We were having some tech issues, but now it's back up and running perfectly. Thank you for that, Craig. Sorry, guys. It happens with tech, right? So as I said, this is weekly webinar. It's brought to you by the Aries Foundation for Financial Education, Inc. Our mission at the foundation is we're trying to help everyone have a better relationship with their money. Our belief, our goal in doing that is that we believe that financial wellness is a contact sport. We mean that literally. There needs to be guidance and engagement because financial wellness is a term that gets bantied about all over the place. And really what it is a whole bunch of usual software or tools or apps that most employees or participants are not using and not participating in because they need that guidance and engagement. You can check us out at www.ariesfoundation.org. That's .org, not .com. So www.ariesfoundation.org. Learn a little bit more about what we do, how we do it, and what we're really trying to do out there. Before I get started with this, I do have some disclosures to go over. since the presentations that we do, these weekly webinars are meant to be educational and informational only. We share this information on our website. You can check that out at ariesfoundation.org/events. You'll see all of the previous the webinars that we've done. We also share it on our YouTube channel. All we ask is that if you are going to use it or share it, you do it in the educational purposes and educational way only for that. The Aries Foundation for Financial Education, Inc. is a nonprofit. We're a recognized nonprofit. We are not affiliated with any securities related or broker dealer, and we're not a registered investment advisor. Craig and I, we strongly suggest to everybody, if you ever have any questions, whether that's on financial, legal, or tax matters, that you seek out the help and ask those questions of a professional. Certainly appreciate that. All right. So that was a lot to go through and got me to a point. Now so this is Thirsty for Knowledge Thursdays. Craig and I like to call this Think with a Drink. We want you to be casual and relaxed and enjoy yourself during these presentations. And we can't think of a better way to do that without having a cold beverage on hand. So that's part of Think with a Drink. Myself this evening, I am drinking Rec League. This is from the Harpoon Brewery. They're a local brewery here in Boston. Rec League is a hazy golden concoction. It's got a little bit of citrus, but it's definitely crisp and clean on the finish. Craig, what are you drinking tonight?
I'm actually going back to one of my favorites. I'm drinking Lights On from Treehouse Brewery out here in Charlton, Mass. One of our favorite hangouts.
Terrific. We do love Treehouse out there. So to everybody out there, if you don't imbibe or can't imbibe, we certainly hope that you have something cold that you can wet your whistle with. Otherwise, we say skål.
Oh,
so our guest for this evening, as we said, we're very excited. We've got two special guests with us. One of them is Bruce Howell from the Carroll Center for the Blind. The other is Mike May from Goodmaps. And I want to bring them in just to have them do a little bit. So Bruce, if you could just introduce yourself, a little bit about yourself and a little bit about the Carroll Center.
Sure. Thanks, Tom. Thanks, Craig, for inviting me to be a part of this tonight. I am Bruce Howell. I manage our accessibility services business line at the Carroll Center for the Blind. The Carroll Center is a 501c3 nonprofit blindness agency. We help people who have lost vision or who have no vision to recapture their lives, to learn the skills that they need to be successful in the world, whether it's to do things at home or to hopefully be able to enter the workforce and have competitive job situations. So I'm delighted to be a part of this tonight and hope that we can share some wisdom.
That's terrific, and we certainly appreciate that, Bruce. Mike, I'm going to turn it to you, and I'm going to ask you first because I struggle a little bit when I try to introduce exactly what Goodmaps is. So a little bit about you, and then about the mission behind Goodmaps.
Yeah, you bet. Thanks to everybody for having me on your webinar. I'm Mike May, Chief Evangelist for Goodmaps. I live in Reno, Nevada, so it's a little early for me to start drinking since I have a lot of my workday left. If I do drink, it's nitro beer. That's my focus these days. And there aren't a lot around, so it's kind of a fun scavenger hunt to find out who has nitro beer, of which Guinness is probably the most famous. I've been blind since age 3. I've been working on accessible navigation for 25 years or more, and I've actually spent my life working on independent navigation because I've found that the key to success in business and in pleasure, recreation, is being able to get around well. And so I had my own company doing this for quite a few years, and last year I joined Goodmaps, and that's what Goodmaps is about, providing accessible navigation and confronting the newest frontier in navigation, which is indoor navigation. And I'll tell you more about that when we get to talking, but certainly indoor within buildings provides us the possibility of accessible navigation in many businesses and to help with employment.
Terrific. And am I to connect this to Boston and part of this, am I right in that either you're still in the bidding for or have been bidding on the MBTA stations here in Boston?
Oh, sure. Yeah, we're bidding on any transportation, accessible transportation opportunities that are out there. And by the way, I didn't mention the connection to the financial services. My very close friend is one of the few blind financial advisors. She works for Morgan Stanley, and that's a very challenging and important job. And certainly getting around well is a big part of her career as well.
That's terrific. Yeah, that's great to hear. Yeah, and that's part of what we're going to be talking about. So the agenda for tonight is really we're going to go through a couple of different topics where we're going to be getting some different information from our two guests, obviously with their years of experience and expertise in all of this, and that's really the adding to the definition of disability topic, finding the right candidate, improving your hiring success, on-site versus working remotely, and then expanding opportunities in the workforce. And so really what I'd like to do is I'm going to start, first question, Bruce, I'm going to sort of throw to you, and it's do you feel that there are any barriers out there that basically get formed during the hiring process as some of the perceptions for being blind, I guess?
Yeah, definitely, Tom. One of the things that I feel is a major factor in terms of the person's ability to have a equal opportunity to be seriously considered for a position at any company is the experience that the hiring manager or the person who will be interviewing you has had previously in their lives with someone who is blind or visually impaired. If that experience was a positive one, where they saw a person be successful and be independent and move around safely, they are more likely to be open and willing to give real consideration to hiring someone who's blind or visually impaired. But sadly, on the other side, if the impression that they've had based on some previous experience observing someone who is visually impaired or blind was not a very positive one, then unfortunately that bias is in their mindset and will make it really hard for them to imagine how someone could perform their job with little or no vision.
Okay, and Mike, sort of a follow to that, sort of similar, anything to add as far as that's concerned?
Whoops, my speech just stomped on your last question. Say that again.
Sorry, I'm sorry about that. I'll try to turn.
No, it wasn't you. It was my jaws. Go ahead.
Okay. It's just that to sort of if you had anything to add to Bruce and to what Bruce was saying there, as far as those biases or those barriers, if you will.
Sure, it's natural, even if somebody doesn't have a preconceived notion about a blind person that they met, just the idea that a lot of sighted people have is that they close their eyes and that's how the world would be, and that's terrifying. It always amazed me when I went for job interviews out of graduate school, a master's degree, and I'd telling the interviewer about my background and traveling all over the place, and they'd applaud my independence. And then when I got up to go, they would trip over themselves trying to help me out and practically carry me back to the elevator and out of the building. So they got it theoretically that, yes, I was independent. I'd traveled around the world. I'd lived in West Africa, but I couldn't find my way out of the building. And that's a real important impression to figure out how do I get over that? Because that's really up to me. That's my responsibility to help get that potential employer over that preconceived notion that a blind person is not capable of finding their way around the office.
Right, and so to stay with that and just to sort of think, sort of on that, do you feel that that's something, and I understand what you're saying from the individual point of view, but that almost creates like a barrier from the employer, the hiring person, like Bruce had mentioned about the, a perceived bias, but do you think that's something that becomes prevalent in that situation?
Well, it's it's a joint problem, if you will, because I go into a situation assuming somebody probably has limited, if any, understanding of the mechanics of how a blind person deals with life, gets around, whatever. So if I assume that, then I try to think of ways that I can help, first of all, demonstrate that I'm independent, so I don't show up to an interview guided by somebody. They can see that I got there on my own, I'm leaving on my own, I'm taking an Uber or a taxi or something. So I'm demonstrating that capability. It's how I comport myself in the meeting, that's showing them what I can do. They still, they're dominated by their notion of how's the blind person going to read, get around, all the rest of it. So I try to get to the point in having a discussion about this is teamwork. You know your company, your business, and what's necessary in order to be successful doing the job. I don't know as much about that as you do, and you don't know as much about being a blind person. So let's just team up. Let's put our best people on it, put our heads together, and I'll help you understand how I operate as a blind person, and you help me figure out how that fits into the context of your job.
Great. Yeah, I appreciate that. And Bruce, to you. So Mike mentioned a little bit about his experience, his own personal, going in and to the hiring process. Do you have something similar to share about your own, a personal situation where you went through that process and sort of felt there was, some sort of back and forth or lack thereof in the hiring process?
Well, there's a couple things that I guess I would bring up to follow on to what Mike said. First of all, my work experience has been really different. I had really good vision when I went through school, and when I was first hired, I actually worked in the financial industry myself. I was a senior vice president of a retail bank for a number of years until my vision got to the point where that work was impossible for me to do. So in my case, I actually hadn't worked for a number of years in any real full-time meaningful position. I went to the Carroll Center, went through some rehabilitation training to establish the skills that I needed to be able to travel safely and to use technology, et cetera. And that enabled me to believe that I could get back into a competitive workplace opportunity. But for me to do it, and one of the ways that a lot of people who are blind or visually impaired find their way back into the world of work, I actually obtained an internship for an organization in downtown Boston. And that enabled me to put into practice all things that I had learned from the Carroll Center's rehabilitation training. I got myself in and out of from the suburbs of Boston into downtown Boston using public transportation, was able to use white cane, mobility cane, to safely walk a few blocks to get to the building, and then navigate within the building to be one of out of 110 employees, the only one that was blind. But just the experience of getting that internship, I had to be able to convince them that I had those abilities to do that. I had both the travel skills, which are really a critical part of being able to get to a job, maybe not so much right now during our COVID remote world, but until then, typically you had to work on location for most jobs. So that was really important to convince them, as Mike said, that you're capable of doing that on your own. But then just to be able to convince them that I had skills, I had prior work experience, I had appropriate soft skills to be able to conduct an interview and not seem terribly different from what a hiring manager would expect to take place during an interview, because that can be challenging for someone who's blind, especially if they're born blind and they don't understand certain visual cues and making eye contact, things along that nature. I had the advantage because I was sighted that most of the things I knew what the appropriate expectations of behavior were. So I think my experience was a little different. I will say that at that stage, though, my vision was so diminished that I had to disclose that I was blind. It isn't something that I was going to get away with pretending that I could see fully. So that disclosure is always an issue for people looking for work as well.
Right. No, and I appreciate that. Thanks for sharing. So Mike, to sort of segue from what Bruce was just talking about and describing, when looking at that from the corporate culture point of view, right? How might having somebody who's blind or visually impaired, positively impact an overall employer's workforce, right? Like Bruce was just describing some of the things he was going through, getting there, being able to travel around on his own, that type of thing. But what kind of positive impacts could come from a corporate culture point of view?
Well, these days, the whole phrase of diversity and inclusion is something that a lot of companies are being measured by, and they have a chief diversity and inclusion officer. That doesn't always include blind people, oddly enough, but it should. It's a broad term for inclusion, and so I think there's credit that companies are looking for in order to include blind people, but they also have their they have their responsibility. They have their manager they answer to, and they have to deliver on certain things, and that involves hiring a person who can do the work. And so there's a bit of a conflict going on. They want to hire you because you're blind, but they also want to make sure that you can do the job and that you're as good or better than the other people who are applying for the job. So this is, again, it's a joint challenge. I think it is exciting when it does happen and that blind person is employed and can excel and set a good example. It makes that manager feel successful for taking a risk. I think back to my job search at a graduate school, and all of my colleagues were getting jobs pretty quickly. And I got many interviews, but I rarely got turned down because nobody wanted to be the bad guy. So they'd always say, well, go talk to this person in another department in the company. And so I'd go do that, and then they'd pass me off to somebody else. So finally, when I was hired by the Bank of California, to this day, I'm thankful to that manager who really did take a chance in hiring me because they didn't know. They had to just trust me and the organizations that were helping to support me at that time, the Lighthouse for the Blind in San Francisco, in Boston, it's going to be the Carroll Center. So he hired me not knowing how that stuff would work, but he thought I had the potential. So he took that risk, and I think that was a huge reward to him and to other people in the company when I made them proud.
Yeah, that's great. Great story. And Bruce, to sort of segue off of Mike's story right there. So if you're somebody who's hiring, right, a visually impaired or blind person into the workforce, like what does that sort of training look like? Like, in terms of the number of people or who should really get that inclusivity, if you will, training?
Wow, that's it's a challenging question to answer, and that's going to be different within different companies or organizations. For it to be successful, I've mentioned the hiring manager has to have some willingness to be brave, to be, what's the right word, creative in terms of how they envision you fitting into the work and what the job sharing or job carving. Those are a couple of terms that maybe we need to define. But basically, someone who's visually impaired, there may be certain pieces of a job that require vision. So how are you going to do that? Are you going to have somebody else do those pieces while the individual who's blind is going to do some of the other individuals' work? Are you going to use some of the technology that's out there that allows you to use your iPhone or your Android phone to get support, visual support through an application in that way? So you've got to have that, the hiring manager has to have that sense of creativity and bravery, if you will, to bring it in. But in terms of the rest of the company, I'm only going to be successful, or Mike's only going to be successful in an environment where we're accepted. We have to prove our abilities, which is the point that he made, which was an excellent one, that we've got to have the skills, the knowledge, the ability, the leadership to do the job correctly and do it really well. But there are certain things that people within the company have to understand and need to be a little different for us. The materials that we need access to have to be accessible, whether these are electronic documents, web applications, things along that line, a copier, a fax machine, things like this. If they are not accessible, then they're going to prevent us from doing our job completely. So that the whole company has to have some understanding where they need to make some changes in their practices to enable us to be successful, or provide the ability through the assistance of someone or a team of people to provide those supports when they crop up. So it takes the entire organization. There are places, I mean, the Carroll Center, we work with companies to help them understand what would be involved with hiring one or more people who are blind or visually impaired to help make that successful. There are physical things you can do in the work settings with lighting, tactile marking, things along that line. And there are other organizations. There's one here in Massachusetts called Work Without Limits, who is really a leader in providing those sort of trainings for companies, colleges, any kind of organization in terms of inclusivity or helping people with all types of disabilities, not just blindness, to be successful within a corporate environment.
Right, and so just to follow up with that, Mike, because one of the things as Bruce was just alluding to, and I know you mentioned it, because you mentioned the Carroll Center, and you mentioned the organization that was in San Fran, I believe.
San Francisco Lighthouse.
Right, so Mike, as far as other resources, like if you're an employer, where else might you go? Is a local state agency type of thing as far as resources and places to turn to?
Yeah, I would add one thing to what Bruce was mentioning. I try to tell a hiring manager, or I suggest this to my friends who are interviewing, since I've not been interviewing in a while, is let's just skip the blindness side. Let's just pretend I'm a sighted guy, and let's talk about the actual skill set. Is there a match between the job and my skills? Let's just address that first. And then if we agree that that looks like high potential, then we can dig into the mechanics. And that's then where I can tell them what I know. We could bring in different agencies. I would know the resources for that, as that's one of the jobs of the blind person interviewing, is you need to be able to tell them, where can we get assistive tools and techniques? Who can fund this stuff? That's a big deal, depending on the side of the company, whether they can fund special equipment, or we have to go to the Department of Rehabilitation to do the funding. So that's one of the elephants in the room that we might have to bring up. And then we might talk about the accessible tools and techniques that would be involved. One of those is navigation, and that's where Goodmaps comes in terms of working with a building, with a company, to map the inside of the building, which is not only beneficial to a blind person, but it's beneficial to everybody, depending on the complexity of that building. And that's one way the blind person can more easily navigate around those offices.
Right.
Mike,
Craig, you got any follow-up to this?
yeah, the same, Mike, just because you're kind of mentioning the elephant in the room. One thing that when you are talking to employers, you said talking about, let's talk about whether my skill set matches a job. Is there any pushback, from a social or public perception, where the company may feel there's some kind of a negative impact, either because they're worried about their own team integrating somebody with a disability, whether they be blind or hearing impaired or something along those lines?
Yeah, everybody's different. Every blind person's different. Every sighted person's different. So you were just dealing about, with human interaction. I mean, I'll give you one good example of how different things are. I tend to not bring up blindness. Let's say I'm on the phone. Somebody doesn't know. They don't see my seeing eye dog. I don't bring that up early in the equation. I certainly don't tell an employer before I get there. Other blind people would say you should. My friend I was talking about as a financial advisor, she tells clients right up front, and she's dealing with tens of millions of dollars, big clients, and there's a lot on the line. And if they feel lack of confidence in her handling their money, they're not going to do any favors to her just because she's blind. Oh, I'm going to be nice to this girl because she's visually impaired. No, they want a competent financial advisor. And she gets that all on the table right up front. So everybody handles this differently.
Right.
Right. So in your opinion, are these some of the main reasons that, you get some pushback with people trying, or why the blind are underemployed?
Well, why we're unemployed, that is the $64 million question. The unemployment rate, we've heard the number of 70% among the blind forever, and that needle doesn't seem to move. And I've worked for organizations trying to address that, and a lot of organizations working on this, and still that needle isn't moving. So there is no easy answer to that, other than making sure we keep doing the things we're doing as organizations and as individuals, because we don't want it to get worse.
Well, that's something like I said, there is a great skill set inside the blind community and hearing impaired community. And I wonder sometimes if that's not tapped enough just because of people's maybe discomfort with dealing with people with a disability. Like, let me ask like a layman question. Like Bruce was talking earlier about, learning where to put your eyes because you don't see well. Well, what about, someone who's working with somebody who's blind? Where do I look when we're having a conversation? It's a silly layman's question.
And by the way, it's well documented that people with disabilities are retained at a much higher level than sighted people without disabilities.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. We know that from the, and just to clue in the audience, just for everybody out there, we did Craig and I did a previous webinar back in early October that was sort of the prequel to this on broad-based diversion and inclusion. And that was definitely something that came from that, Mike, which was that the retention rate, the hiring rate is very, very low. The retention rate, however, is extremely high on that situation. So let me start with this in a different way, because we're talking about finding the right candidate now. And Bruce, from your experience, because obviously you've sort of dealt with this now on both sides, if you will. You have been somebody who's been through the process, but you're also somebody who helps employers deal with the process. And do you think that some of the online or hiring process actually inadvertently will screen out a candidate?
Yeah, I think this is still a real risk. I think things are improving in terms of accessibility for some of the hiring platforms that are out there and available that companies use. But two things come to mind in responding to this. One is the job requirements themselves. How often do you see the requirement that a person must have a valid driver's license, but you look down to the job description and the chances of actually needing to drive anywhere are either extremely remote or so infrequent that, hey, I can use Lyft or Uber to get there, so why would I need to be able to drive? So I think hiring managers and people creating the job descriptions really need to look at those and figure out, are there things that we're putting in here that are unintentionally screening out people who are blind or visually impaired from being even willing to try to apply? And then the other big issue, and this is true for people with all disability types, not necessarily just blindness, is the accessibility of the online process itself for finding the jobs, being able to read about the jobs, and then submitting, the whole application process. Typically, if you're using an online site application process, it's a multi-screen process where you've got to add information, either type it in or upload documents that you have. And any piece of that, if it's not accessible, if there's a button that isn't labeled, so I don't know what I'm supposed to do in a certain place, there can be a factor. Sometimes these are timed experiences, and it may take me a little longer as a screen reader user to be able to fill everything in, complete it, so I can get shut out of the whole process just because I couldn't do that initial piece as quickly as someone who's sighted might be able to do it. So these are real concerns, and we try to talk to companies and make sure that they're using a platform that is accessible, or in the worst case, if they're not, do they have a suitable alternative method for someone who can't use that process for applying to still be able to apply and be just as equally considered as people who apply online.
Right, absolutely. Yeah, one of the things that came from that previous webinar that I was talking about was one of those questions is gap in employment, right? If there's a break in history that, that seems to be a trip up for a lot of times where it may not have been nothing more than the person's just not the ability to work, but the minute they see a gap in employment for a period of time, that usually is some sort of a knockout, if you will, in terms of the question.
Yeah,
so
John,
Mike,
John, can I just follow up on that just a little?
Yeah.
Sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt you, but because I meant to mention this earlier too, that, we talked about the whole interviewing process and what goes on there. And I know I'm a older candidate at this point. I don't know how old Mike is, but a lot of times young applicants who are visually impaired haven't had those same kind of part-time job experiences because of their visual impairment. So not even just a gap, but how do you create a resume that can convince an employer that you have skills that would be transferable to the job can be just as difficult at the beginning. So they need to think about what they've done for volunteer positions and be able to phrase those in ways that are going to be equitable to the kind of skills that they need to have for the job.
Yeah, that's a very good point. I think that goes right to what Mike was saying earlier about, hey, if we can take being blind off the table and just talk to me about skills that I have and what I'm able to do. So let me ask you this, Mike, as far as a follow-up question with that. So if I'm an employer and I'm looking to hire somebody who's visually impaired or blind, where would I start? Like, where would I go? I understand the Carroll Center is there, but is there someplace that I would go just to begin this conversation or to maybe get an idea of what I should do?
Well, you're probably putting out your job requisition on the various sites and perhaps on LinkedIn. That's a good place to find people. If you specifically wanted to, let's say I have a job and I think, let's say it's a lot of times blind people get pigeonholed into customer service phone jobs. But job's a job, so that's a fine one. So they reach out to a blindness organization, a place like the American Foundation for the Blind, the National Federation of the Blind, American Council of the Blind. They all have work, employment reference, both resources to help people get a job, but also mentor programs and other ways to help assist. If an employer calls up and said, I'm looking for some blind people, where do I find them? That's one way to do it. I was executive director of the Workforce Innovation Center in Vision in Wichita, Kansas, and the customer service and the telephone operator system was certainly something that we looked into because it's where you can employ the most, the high volume, the numbers of blind people, 10, 20, 50. Whereas a lot of other positions, it might be onesie, twosie. So it's hard to make a dent in unemployment when you're talking about one thing at a time. So those resources are out there, but I think the bigger problem is getting those employers to be open to hiring the blind people, not as much about them seeking them out to begin with.
Right, and I think part of what you're saying is sort of follows in with what Bruce was alluding to. The whole, trying to build a resume. It doesn't matter who you are, right? At some point you've got to try to build up that job, qualification skills. And if you can find something that's at least getting you in the door, it's a way to do that. So I think that's certainly a positive. And so just to sort of ask that question, because I know you've both been through it, and I know, Mike, from your side of it, you've been on the other side, it sounds like, is it different? Like, should employers be doing anything different if they're interviewing somebody who's blind or visually impaired, or should the process be exactly the same for everybody? Mike, I'll go to you.
It should be the same, but it also needs to accommodate that person. So if there's something involved in giving a PowerPoint or something that involves something that's going to really limit the blind person's ability to perform, well, they should mitigate that circumstance.
Bruce, anything to add to that as far as that interview process?
Yeah, maybe I will differ a little bit from Mike in his response. I agree with everything Mike just said, but I think that if you're seriously trying to create a diverse workforce and you want to incorporate people with disabilities into it, you do have to have a little bit of knowledge about what those disabilities might mean in terms of how somebody would perform in an interview process. Again, as I mentioned, if it's a young candidate who's visually impaired, particularly if he or she has been blind from birth, they're not going to understand the visual cues of looking at the person's face, of maybe even posture. I mean, you could argue, and Mike would probably argue, that it's their responsibility to learn about these things and be able to perform sort of to the norm that the interviewer expects. But I think, and it goes beyond blindness. If you're hiring people with neuro spectrum challenges, you would want to understand a little bit about what behaviors you're going to encounter there and try to discount those, because you're trying to get at the person, the skill that they're going to bring, the other values that they're going to bring to your company or organization in terms of leadership, problem solving, reliability, things along that line. So sometimes I think in an interview situation, at least, people are going to have to be a little bit more open-minded than what they maybe are used to being.
Right.
Yeah, I agree 100%. An employer, I mean, if they want to find good people, they're looking beneath the surface. And if you get hung up on the surface, then you're never going to dig deeper and find out what's underneath. And so in the case of a blind person, they want to make sure that if they have any education ahead of time, and I think a lot more companies are becoming educated. Certainly having a webinar like this is a step in that direction if somebody's listening. There's the Disability In conference and many others. There are great big conferences that have a lot of employers attending them. So hopefully that education is going somewhere to getting them prepared for the process of finding disabled employees.
Yeah, and that's a great point. That again, and Bruce had mentioned as well. Here, in Massachusetts, we've worked Without Limits, Disability In. They're in that network of dealing with that. Great organizations. One of the things that I want to sort of flip this a little bit with that and talk now. What if I'm an employer? What sort of risk factors, right, might I be looking at if I decide, all right, I'm going to hire somebody who's blind or visually impaired, what risk factors might I be watching? Bruce,
Yeah.
what do you?
Okay, there are a few. It's not always a simple, seamless prospect to do this. First of all, what technology does the person going to require? I mean, where do I start? The individual has to have the appropriate training to use the techniques, the assistive technologies that they're going to bring to the job. So in my case, I'm a person who's virtually no vision now, so I have to use screen reader technology, both on my computer, on my smartphone, any device that I'm going to be using. I require audible output to me so that I know what I'm doing, I can follow along and accomplish. So your first risk is, does the person truly have those skills? Are they going to be able to do the things that they claim they can do? They may say they know how to use Excel, and maybe they do, but how much do they know? So, sort of like you're checking out the skill set of any potential person that you're hiring. It's more than just the knowledge of the application, but it's the knowledge of how you as a person who's blind or visually impaired going to be able to interact with that same application that your coworkers are using. So there's that factor. And then who's going to pay for some of these technologies? And I think Mike started to talk a little bit about this earlier, but in some cases, the VR agency in Massachusetts, it happens to be the Massachusetts Commission for the Blind, they'll provide supports. They'll provide some of the tech support in terms of the software that the person might need and the training. But at some point, they expect to be weaned out of that process, and the company would be responsible for maintaining that and upgrading to the current versions of the various technologies that the person needs to use. So there are challenges along there that come into play. And then just from a personnel standpoint, and again, we talked about this earlier, how receptive are the coworkers that the individual is going to be working with going to be to dealing with things maybe as simple as making sure you don't leave doors halfway open, or you don't leave things in the hallway that the individual might fall over. If you're painting in a corridor somewhere, are you making sure that your employee who is blind is aware of these things that are going on? So there are some communication things that have to happen on a continual basis, and there are some actual behavioral modifications, if you will, that people probably will need to make sure that it's a successful experience for everybody.
Yeah, Bruce and I both mentioned the comment of employers being brave. And that's part of taking risks. You got to be brave if you take risks. And I think that's very much the case with anybody you hire because you're making a leap of faith based on a couple hours of interviews and a background check and a few references, and you're hoping that your judgment is good and that it's going to pan out. And there's a risk that it won't.
Right, but and as you both have said, and I think this comes across, for everything, is a lot of this is the same, whether we're dealing with somebody who's a typical person or we're dealing with somebody who's visually impaired, that all of those things apply, right? I got to know that this person's going to be a good fit with everybody else on my team, if you will, if I'm hiring manager, and I got to know that they're the right candidate for the job. So, I mean, I get that. And I think that's really what needs to come across here is that those are the same factors. The rest of it, like Mike has said, should just be off to the side. That should be something that's a consideration after the fact once you make that determination. Because let's face it, if you hire somebody, I don't care if they're typical or visually impaired, if they're not the right person or they're not going to mix with your team, it's not going to work out no matter what. All right, so I want to flip a little bit here to what becomes more of a COVID question, right? More of on-site versus working remotely. And, this is just sort of my own perspective on this and on these things. But, I think that remote versus on-site, there's a lot of factors that go into this when somebody's thinking, the type of job, the responsibilities, personal preferences, that type of thing. But like I said, so if I'm looking at it from that, and Bruce, I want to start with you. Why might somebody who's blind or visually impaired prefer to work on-site versus remotely?
Tech support would be one of the major reasons that I can think of. As wonderful as screen readers are and laptops and things, sometimes they don't work right. I think you had a little tech glitch right at the beginning of this presentation today.
We always have tech glitch.
Yeah, well, everybody always has tech glitches. So one of the issues when you're working remotely is where's your support going to come from if you suddenly have a problem? Now, there are solutions. There are things that can be done that allow somebody to have access to your device to be able to do it. But it's easier when you're in person and you can turn to your sighted coworker and say, hey, what's on my screen? I can't tell what's going on. So I think that's one of the factors that's really great. I think a less tangible one, and I've been working remotely now for the last 7+ months, so I know the difference. I miss being able to just have that human contact. If you got a question about something today at home, it's either an email, a text, a phone call, or a Zoom meeting. But when I'm on site at the Carroll Center working there, I can literally get up and I can walk down the hall, or I can walk down a flight of stairs and go to a different building, find the person I need to get an answer from. We have a quick discussion. It's done. So I do think that there are some real positives for working live on location.
And so, Mike, I'm going to flip it. You're in Reno, so we're going to flip it to you out there in the wonderful. You're not in the desert, but close to it. Why would someone who's visually impaired prefer to work remotely?
Yeah, we call this the high desert. It's about 5,000 feet.
Yeah.
Well, it depends on the individual, first off, because some people are just not wired for remote working. I've worked about 50% of my 40-year career remotely, and I've learned to pick people. When I had a company where everybody was remote, I was adept at finding people who were self-starters and didn't get distracted by home things and really appreciated the flexibility and the fact that they didn't have to eat up 2 hours a day at least in commute time. Right. So part of it is just, is that person wired for it? In terms of blind people, beyond those factors, there's transportation. So if you can work remotely, you get rid of that whole transportation issue, which might dictate where you live. You might have to live in a city if you need to have good transportation. You don't want to live in the city. You want to live in the suburbs or in a rural area. So I think that transportation issue is important, and the fact that now the world is getting more used to remote work, that more employers are open to it and seeing that it's actually beneficial to them. I think that's going to net benefit blind people.
That was going to be my question. Is actually is with this going on, do you feel this is an opportunity because a larger segment of employers are not or are allowing work from home? This may present some additional opportunities.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. I've worked for a couple of companies, and they were just against remote employment, and they missed out on a lot of opportunities and some really skilled people because they wanted that person to relocate. Like when I was in Wichita, Kansas, not everybody wants to live in Wichita. And so if we could have hired some people remotely, I think we could have gotten some good employees that way.
Mike, I agree with that because here in the Boston area where the housing is so expensive too, it's a huge advantage when we can actually tap into a remote workforce where they don't have to move here because that is oftentimes a real factor for them deciding not to take a position.
Yeah, my company is in Louisville, and so when I joined, it was with the understanding that I would work remotely in Wichita. And then I thought, well, where else do I want to move closer to my family and friends and skiing? So I picked Reno and I moved here. That's a huge opportunity in terms of lifestyle and being able to continue a job. And now, of course, previously, most of the other people in the company worked in the office, and now they're all working remotely too and liking it.
Right. And I think that's what you're getting here is you're getting more and more of that. So last topic I want to touch on before we finish things up here. This is the expanding the opportunities in the workforce, right? And so Bruce, I'm going to start with you. If I put the feet to the fire, if you will, if the number one concern that somebody who's visually impaired might have when they're trying to find a job, what would that number one concern be, or what would be their like the stigma that somebody who's trying to find a job have about trying to get hired?
Well, the thing that of course, it depends on the job requirements, but assuming that vast majority of jobs these days involve some kind of interaction with technology, either you've got to use some application on a computer or even a particular device to do your job requirements. It's the accessibility of that, the content that you've got to be able to get into and use, whether it's a database or it's Excel or it's some kind of proprietary application that the company uses, Salesforce, some other kind of customer management service. Can I use it? Because screen readers are great and they can figure out a lot of things and they can enable us to do a lot, but there are certain aspects of the way things are designed or coded that you can't overcome on your own with a screen reader. So then it involves something called scripting, which can be really time consuming and expensive. And anytime there's an upgrade to the software, it can knock out that scripting. So I think because our world is just going more and more in the direction of technology, my concern is it's always going to be the accessibility of what the person needs to work with in their job that is their biggest fear. Even if they get the job and it's working, is something going to get messed up and then I can't do it? And we deal with this at the Carroll Center. I mean, we're helping employees all the time because there have been changes in the software that they have to use or changes to the operating system of their Windows computer and they can't do things the same way. So we're always kind of chasing accessibility in technology.
Mike, go ahead.
Yeah, 100%. That is the real challenge. I mean, you have to get the job and you go through all of that, and the employer has other concerns. But as a blind person, when I go into a job, even if that employer is committed to, we're going to make this work, you don't know if they're going to follow through when push comes to shove. It may be that you need some combination of sighted assistance, other technology. You might have to pay for something like IRA, and then there's privacy issues because it's company data, things that they're looking at. You can't have an IRA agent looking over your shoulder at these things. All of these questions can be a real challenge, and so you really need an employer that's committed to some financial aspect of supporting you, but also maybe breaking policy a little bit to do things differently than they're used to, because so many companies are about processes and systems, and that's how they survive. And we don't always, we're a square peg in a round hole a lot of times.
That's, I was going to ask as a follow-up to Tom's question, what steps and measures do you feel an organization could take to try and make sure that the playing field is level for all employees?
Well, I think it's that employer really making an honest commitment. One of the most significant ones in my career was my first job out of graduate school is working for the CIA, and I was the first blind person to work there. And at that time, they were very little computerized. Everything for a political analyst was print, which is not a blind person's best friend. And so Admiral Turner, the DCI at the time, said, "We will make this work for you. If something isn't happening, you have permission to call me directly and I'll make it happen." That's really ultimately what you want at the most senior level, that the company's committed to making it work, and then it will.
Wonderful.
Yeah, I would totally agree with that, Mike. That's excellent. The word that comes to mind for me is communication, Craig. That there has to be open communication where the employee who's blind or vision impaired feels like he has someone that he or she can speak with when they sense something is maybe going wrong or anticipating an issue. But it's great to talk, but unless you have that commitment from the top down, there's no assurance that it will be resolved appropriately.
Yeah, and I think that's a great point, Bruce. And Mike, there's sort of the same concept there, that top-down thinking, that ultimately that's what drives everything, right? If it's coming from the top, then basically everybody else is going to sort of line up and follow along. Listen, we're coming right up on the hour here, which is what we try to do. So I do want to ask Craig, do we got any questions from the audience? Anybody out there with any questions? You've got our guests on right now, so feel free. If you got to, obviously you don't want to ask us questions. We want questions for Bruce or Mike, to see if there's anybody out there. You got anything, Craig?
I have nothing in the hopper at the moment.
Okay, so I'm going to wind this up. We certainly appreciate everybody taking the time with us tonight. We certainly appreciate our guests. I'm going to bring them in for a little close in a second. As I said, this is Thirsty for Knowledge Thursdays. So to keep that theme along, we like to say, what's on tap? What do we have coming up for the next couple of weeks? Next week, we're actually going to do a healthy and wealthy through the holidays. So next Thursday, the 19th, we've got somebody coming in who's going to do some follow-up and ways to, be healthy, stay healthy. Craig and I will talk ways not to overspend your stress relief during the holidays. And then on the 3rd, we're off for the Thanksgiving break. We've got somebody coming in to do charitable gifting strategies for organizations. Obviously, with COVID and the shutdown and everything, it's been very, very difficult for it. So I do want to ask Bruce, if you can start, just how can people reach out and get a hold of you or get in touch with you?
Sure. My email address is Bruce, BRUCE .Howell. It's H as in Harry, OWELL @carroll.org. And Carroll is spelled CARROLL. That's probably the easiest way. Just drop me an email. If I'm not the right person, I can certainly connect anyone with the appropriate person at the Carroll Center for whatever they might be interested in learning about.
Terrific. Appreciate that. And Mike, for you, if somebody wants to learn a little bit more about Goodmaps, where should they go?
Right. We have a goodmaps.com website where there's videos of users in action and flyers and so forth. We're happy if anybody's interested in scoping out the cost of having their building mapped for any number of reasons. That's what we do. And we have an accessible app, which is free and people can download on the App Store. It's called Goodmaps, one word, Explore. And you can reach me by emailing mike@goodmaps.com.
I certainly appreciate that. And just for my own, just for the audience out there, I would just go to the site because it's a very, very cool system when you go on there and it does the whole little walk around for you and shows you all the videos and what you can do with that software. It is very, very cool. So I'm going to say goodnight. Again, thank you to our guests for this evening. This was tremendous. We appreciate your time. If you do want to get information from us, like I said, you can go to the site, www.aresfoundation.org, or our email is info@aresfoundation.org. And with that, I am going to stop the recording